The day after buying the Fiesta, I went to reverse the car and noticed the car was sagging on the driver's side and the coil spring was hard up against the tyre. On removing the wheel, I was shocked to see the spring had snapped, but more worrying was the sharp point of the spring being level with the tyre. So here's a photo that I took with my iPhone, and as you can see, that spring end was right by the tyre. And here's another photo of the snapped area and a close-up of it. Having replaced the broken spring earlier in the week for £26.40, I was going to leave the matter there, until I did some online research, and the net was full of horror stories of these springs failing as early as 10,000 miles. Some had the spring harpoon the tyre at 60 miles an hour and cause a dangerous blowout. Okay, I was convinced I must replace the passenger side as well before I drive the vehicle again. Hence this video on the passenger spring being replaced. Other than a trolley jack and axle stands, you would need the following for this job. 1 or 2 new coil springs such as KYB RH3508, 19mm socket and flat bladed screwdriver, 15mm socket for the strut pinch bolt, 15mm spanner and 5mm Allen key, 13mm spanner for the 3 top mounting nuts, 18mm strut socket with 6mm Allen key, spring compressor and a torque wrench for 25, 48, 85 and 90 Newton meters. So this is the spring I'm going to use, which is a KYB RH3508. And there it is, a nice new spring. You'll also need a 19mm socket for the road wheels and also the locking key if it needs one. And don't forget, you'll also need the flat bladed screwdriver to remove the hub. You'll need a 15mm socket for the pinch bolt, and you'll need a 15mm spanner and 5mm Allen key as well. For the 3 top nuts, it would be a 13mm spanner. You might need a hammer to try and smack the hub off the strut. You'll also need the torque wrench and an 18mm specialist socket that goes on top of the piston, and you use that with a 6mm Allen key, and the Allen key locks the piston in position while you torque the nut that's on the very top of the strut with a torque wrench, like so. There I'm using a crow's foot to help with that. You also need the spring compressors, 2 minimum, possibly 4 makes it easier, and very importantly some safety eyewear, because dealing with springs is very dangerous. It's worth opening the bonnet at this stage before jacking the car up. So the bonnet release is in the passenger footwell. So on this car you pull this little lever and that releases the bonnet, and then the bonnet stay is located on the left of the engine, like so. Now to remove the road wheel, jack the Ford Fiesta up and place on at least 1 axle stand for safety. So I'm going to get the jack into position and just lift the car very slightly, because first what we need to do is break the nuts loose on the 4 nuts of the road wheel. So we'll just loosen each of those, and then we can jack the car up properly. And then we can just spin those nuts off. There's one. This is the last one now. And then we can remove the road wheel and put that somewhere safe. Now I'm also going to put an axle stand under, just in case the jack was to fail and perhaps crush my hand or something like that. It's always worth using an axle stand. Using a 13mm spanner, just slightly loosen the 3 nuts on the struts inside the engine bay. Don't touch the larger 18mm centre nut on the strut rod. With those nuts loose, we can now use the 15mm spanner and a 5mm Allen key to undo and remove the drop link from the strut. Here's a photo showing the drop link that needs to be removed. So I'm going to spray this with a little bit of penetrating fluid to try and make removing the nut a bit easier, and also to try and avoid damaging the Allen key head as well, because being that it's quite old, it's probably quite easy for that metal to actually round off with the Allen key. So this is a 15mm spanner and 5mm Allen key. So the Allen key just holds it from rotating, and then use your spanner just to undo that. So once that's then removed, we can unclip the ABS signal cable, which is on that bracket as well. So just pop that cable off. It's held in there at the top and on the actual bracket itself. So with the use of a pry bar, I'm just gently going to push this down so that it makes it easier for me to remove that bracket, like so. And there's the drop link. We can just push that back out the way now. The workshop manual does say to remove the brake caliper carrier and the brake disc. When I saw the rusty condition of those carrier bolts, I decided to give that part a miss, as I might have needed new bolts afterwards. Next, I removed the metal clip that holds the flexible brake pipe to the suspension strut. So I've coloured the clip blue here in this photo. So we just need to use a suitable punch or drift just to tap that out, like so. Note which way it was fitted, and then you can use a flat bladed screwdriver just to pull it out the rest of the way. Now, as you can see, mine was quite rusty, as was the little plate that the brake pipe was sitting into. So I gave mine a little shake with the end of a hammer just to break the rust free. And then that part lifts up and then out. Using the 15mm socket, now undo the pinch bolt that holds the strut to the hub. Because of the bolt being so rusty, I had to resort to a 14mm 6-point socket and hammer it in to lock it on. So here's a photograph showing the pinch bolt with the strut, and here's another photo showing that pinch bolt. So I sprayed it with a little bit of penetrating fluid, because it is quite tight in there, and this is the socket that in the end I did have to hammer that on. So using a breaker bar, we then break that loose, and then it comes out. There we are. We can now tap the hub downwards to free it from the base of the strut. It's worth having a strap handy, as the hub will want to fall away and bring the drive shaft out of the gearbox, which could result in the loss of gearbox oil. So I pre-sprayed it with plenty of penetrating fluid, because as you can see on my car here, there is a fair bit of surface rust. So it's a case of keep tapping, making sure you don't actually hit that ABS sensor wire, and just keep going gently at it. I then put a strap round in preparation for when the strut is removed, that the hub would then fall away and pull the drive shaft out of the gearbox, with the loss of gearbox oil as well, and obviously a bit of a mess. So I've got my strap ready for that, and as you can see, it's now coming off the strut, and I keep giving it plenty of penetrating fluid. A bit more tapping there, so it's nearly off now. So it's just on the edge. So a little bit more penetrating fluid there, a few more taps. So basically the strut is now free from the hub. Not technically necessary, but since the strut was still struggling to lift free of the hub, I added some spring compressors to take some tension off the hub to ease removal of the strut. So as you can see, the strut is just on the edge of coming out, but not quite. So I've added a couple of spring compressors on either side of the spring, just to try and take some of the tension off the strut itself, so that hopefully I can push the strut assembly upwards on the damper, because the damper should be free to move up with some of the tension taken off. And now you can see the strut is basically free. With the strut effectively free, we can now finish removing the 3 nuts on the top of the strut inside the engine bay. So using a 13mm spanner again, we just need to finish removing these 3 nuts. The strut is now totally free to be withdrawn. Just watch the drive shaft doesn't drop out at this point and be ready to strap the hub to keep it in position. So with a little bit of manipulation now, we should be able to withdraw that whole strut assembly. Now as I'm pulling on this, you can see that the drive shaft is pulling with it, so you do want to be careful you don't pull that drive shaft out. At this point I use my knee just to hold the brake disc against the drive shaft, which is against the gearbox, because obviously I don't want that drive shaft dropping out. I can now use that strap that I put on earlier just to take the tension and hold that hub assembly firm against the gearbox. And there's our strut assembly now ready to remove the spring. Now we can take the whole strut assembly to the workbench for disassembly. These springs are under a huge amount of tension, and since the reason for replacing the spring is the fear of it suddenly failing, it's really important to wear face and eye protection. So here's a photo showing all the parts of the strut, and this is the part we're going to be working on now. So I'm going to put on safety glasses and also a face visor, because I know how dangerous these springs can be. So we just need to compress the spring so it takes the tension off, and then we can undo that top single nut. With the old spring now compressed, we can use the 6mm Allen key to hold the piston rod steady while we use the 18mm strut socket to remove the central nut. So using the 18mm specialist strut socket, or that one I made myself, and the 6mm Allen key, I'm going to use a crow's foot spanner there, and then use the Allen key just to hold the piston rods steady while you undo the 18mm nut. It's very tight as well. It's not the easiest to undo. Right, so with that undone, we can just take that 18mm nut off now, and then we can safely remove the upper bearing and spring seat. This will come out with the gaiter as well. Now the gaiter is actually pushed over a couple of plastic clips at the end, so what you need to do is unhook the gaiter at the end. As you can see there now, that's pulling on the gaiter. So just pull the gaiter back, unclip that at the end, and then it should all come away like so. So we can remove that part now, and there's the spring that we need to replace, leaving the strut with the rod in position. Now remove the spring compressor clamps. Okay, I'm going to just mark where the actual clamps are on the spring on the old one, because this should help me when I come to put the new spring on, because obviously the position worked here for removing the spring without it binding or catching. So I'm going to note that, and then we can now remove the clamps. Now the clamps did come undone all the way, and still the spring was still stuck. So I then used a second set of springs just to put it down slightly so that I could then release the original clamps, and then I removed those clamps. So sometimes it is easier if you have 4 of these clamps, because then you can maneuver the spring a little bit more. So anyway, so now the clamps are all off, and because I do like marking things, I'm going to transfer those original paint marks now onto the new spring. And make sure you have the spring the right way round. One end was flatter than the other, and the flat end would be at the top where those 3 nuts are on the strut. So make sure you line the spring up exactly as the old spring was, so that you can fit it in exactly the right way. Before fitting the new spring, we need to check the condition of the thrust bearing for smooth operation. Also inspect the strut for damage, pitting or oil leaking. With the strut held vertically, check the piston rod goes up and down smoothly with no jerky movement. Replace if the strut appears faulty or worn out. So here's some photos showing you the different parts of the strut assembly, and here's the 32 bore bearings in the top part. Make sure you don't lose those if you open it. So now we can tension our new spring. So I've put the clamps back where they were originally with the paint marks, so I know that makes it easier for me to remove the clamps later on. So I'm going to use 4 clamps again. Does seem easier with 4. So now we can put the spring onto the actual strut, and note where the stop location is for the bottom of the coil. It sits just there at the bottom. Now we can put the gaiter back in, and then we can clamp that down a bit more because the central piston rod's not protruding enough through the top part. So I'm just going to pull that down a bit more. Refit the central 18mm nut. So with the spring compressed enough, we should better put the 18mm nut back on, and then we can just tighten that up, and we will need to torque it. Now torque the piston rod nut to 48 Newton meters. This is where the specialist socket comes into play, as you need to use the 6mm Allen key through the centre of the socket to stop the rod rotating while you turn the socket. So I've set my torque wrench to 48 Newton meters, and we need to use the special strut socket, which we can hold on the outside while we put the Allen key in the middle, and then we need to torque that to the 48 Newton meters. Easier said than done. We can now take the tension off the spring and remove the spring compressor clamps. So we can now remove these clamps. Now what I'm also going to do is just move that spring and make sure that the bottom of the coil is actually pressed up against the stop, which you can just see at the bottom there. So I can now release the tension on these and remove all 4 clamps. Again, you should always be wearing eye protection when doing this, just in case something went wrong. There we are. So all we've got to do now is put that gaiter on. So we've got to pull that gaiter down and clip it over the lugs at the bottom. We need to push the protective gaiter back onto the holding lugs. You might find this easier to do with the actual strut in a vise, because then you can push harder from inside the coil. There we are, that's back on now. So that strut's all ready to go back on the car. Now the reverse procedure to refit the completed strut back onto the car. So if we take the completed strut now And note that on the back of this there is like a lug, I'll picture it here, which must be inserted into the back of the hub. So anyway, so if we insert this upwards and get those 3 bolts up into the engine bay, just locate those, pop those up, and then we can get those 3 nuts back on there. We don't need to do it up too tight just yet, just so that it takes the weight of the strut for us. I'll put the last nut on now. So I'm not going to fully tighten these because we will need to torque these with a torque wrench. But I just want them sufficiently tight. With the strut supported from above, we can relocate the base of the strut back into the hub, making sure the locating lug is lined up on the back of the strut assembly. So with the location lug in mind, we now need to push down on the hub and try and wiggle the strut back into its housing. So I have put a little bit of copper grease on there just to try and make it easier. So give it a little bit of a twist and turn until you can feel that lug on the rear locate into the split part of the hub, and that's what the pinch bolt will lock up. I'll now use a jack to push that up. So I'll now use a second jack just to exert some pressure upwards to fully seat the strut into the hub, like so. I'm just going to torque those 3 nuts inside the engine bay using a 13mm crow's foot to 25 Newton meters. So with my torque wrench set to 25 Newton meters, I put a crow's foot on because of the other 2 nuts at the back, but sadly it wouldn't actually fit in at the back either. So I had to guess that, which isn't too hard. 25 Newton meters isn't very tight. Now the 15mm hub pinch bolt can be replaced and torqued to 85 Newton meters. So I can take my pinch bolt now, pop that in. That brake line is quite a rigid line, that. It's not very flexible. Now that should be set to 85. I looked the figures up somewhere else and it said 90. Haynes said 85, so I would go with 85. Obviously I've done mine to 90. That's only 5 Newton meters. There we are. Then the drop link bar, and for that we use the 15mm spanner and a 5mm Allen key. Again, a crow's foot can be helpful in this situation to apply the 48 Newton meters torque. I'm just going to use a pry bar to help me get this drop link located back on the strut, like so. We can then put the bracket back on that holds the ABS cable, pop the nut back on, spin it on quick, and 48 Newton meters, and I'll use a crow's foot for this, making sure it's at 90 degrees to the end of the torque wrench, like so, and then using our Allen key to hold it, we can apply the torque. Don't forget to pop the ABS cable back onto the 2 holders. So it's held on in 2 places, one on the bracket there, and then one just behind on the back. Then the brake pipe needs to be re-secured again. So this is quite awkward, this part. So you locate the brake pipe back in and then push it down. As you can see, mine's quite rusty. doesn't make it easy. And then make sure you get that the right way up, this spring clip, and then that needs to be popped in and then tapped in with a hammer very carefully. I think I might have had that upside down because it didn't want to go back in, so I think in the end I flipped it over. So note which way that comes out. Lastly, we can refit the road wheel and torque the 4 nuts to 90 Newton meters. Just as a precaution, if you accidentally dripped oil or penetrating fluid onto the brake disc, then clean the disc at this stage before putting the wheel back on. So I'm just going to jack up the car, remove the bottle jack that I'd put on the rear, and also remove the axle stands under the front. So I can now pop the wheel back on. Like so. And put the 4 nuts back on. I'll speed this part up. And also my locking nut. So we'll whiz those on. Just do them hand tight. And then we can drop the car back down. And now we must torque those nuts to 90 Newton meters. So there we are. Set the torque wrench to 90. Second one, third one, and fourth one. And then put our little cover back on and close the bonnet, and job's all done. Since I had one fouled spring and one still complete, I thought it might be of interest to compare the two side by side. Now, looking at the two springs together, it appears that the rust is in exactly the same area as on the spring that failed. So in hindsight, I'm glad I changed that second spring. I think these need changing in pairs. Here are some detailed photographs with labels to help with identifying all the visible parts. I will put them on for only 4 seconds each, with the idea that you can pause them for detailed viewing. Thank you for watching, and hope this helped other home mechanics out.